Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour, broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about a 50th anniversary of a beloved Brisbane institution that formed out of radical protesters under Bjelke Petersen and survived that and continues to flourish. It's not 4ZZZ, it's a different one that's also celebrating its 50th anniversary. It is Women's House, which was the first domestic violence shelter in Brisbane. It started in 1975 and it is still going. It's probably a bit less of a happy anniversary as 4ZZZ because we're always going to need independent media and we want ZZZ to last forever, whereas Women's House, as we will hear in this interview, when they set it up, they were hoping that it would be a short-lived institution that would quickly outgrow its usefulness. Unfortunately, it has not been the case, but they have done a lot of great work and supported a whole lot of women in that time, and we're going to hear all about that journey today on the show. I spoke with Barb and Chantal from Women's House. They've both been involved since the 80s and are still going there. I went down and had a yarn with them about the history of Women's House, about I guess what's changed over the last 50 years and what the situation is like now for that organisation. It was an amazing era, that time of the early to mid 70s, of political change in Australia, and it is interesting to reflect on that and the things that enabled changes to happen, both at a big political level, but also what was happening in people's homes, in people's minds, you know, as they were analysing the society that they lived in and being honest about things like domestic violence, which has been going on for a long time, but had been kept behind closed doors so often or had been taboo to speak about. But yeah, here we are in 2015 and we should be thinking about what kind of things do we want to change now for the next generations as well. And so inspiring to hear about the history, but also that all these institutions are still going and evolving and changing as it goes. So anyway, let's get into my first part of the interview with Barb and Chantal from Women's House.
I'm Chantal. I work at Women's House Shelter. And
I'm Barb. I also work at Women's House Shelter.
We're talking because we're celebrating 50 years of
Yay.
Women's House.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I guess to start off with, do you want to just give us a bit of an overview of what Women's House is?
Sure. Women's House is the general garden variety name for the Women's Community Aid Association. Women's Community Aid Association is the incorporated body that auspices a number of services. Two main services. It's Women's House Shelter that provides domestic violence support to women and children escaping domestic and family violence, and also refuge accommodation. And there's the Brisbane Rape and Incest Survivors Support Centre, which provides sexual assault support. And within the association now, there's also a First Nations women's collective, Yadjan.
And we're in a Queensland with the underneath built in here. Has it always been in this house?
No, this is... We moved here in the late 1990s. This is our main office, but that now there's a couple of other offices in the Brisbane area, north side, south side, another one spilling out at Maruka, because the service has grown over the last couple of years especially.
Oh, no, but there's been various spots. I think first off in the city, and then Spring Hill and Red Hill and West End, Highgate Hill here. But we're very lucky that we managed to purchase this building, so that's pretty fortunate in this time of incredible rising rents and crisis, lack of accommodation generally. Like, it's a long time ago, 50 years, but I think, 1975 was a pretty interesting time, and certainly this women's house was set up by women who identified themselves as women's liberationists. I think it was a time when there was beginning to be a sort of a political consciousness in terms of, violence against women, that women had always kind of blamed themselves, but then I think there were discussions happening and people realising that they weren't actually alone, or women realising they weren't actually alone dealing with kind of problems of violence.
It was also considered a private issue, either sexual violence wasn't talked about, it was something that was, a source of shame, and for domestic violence or intimate partner violence was considered a private issue and not the purview of the state. Women who were survivors of violence were starting to gather together and look at issues of women's oppression, underpayment, women's health, violence.
So how did it happen? Like, what's the origin story of how Women's House started 50 years ago?
It actually started, I think, in about 1973 with a group of, as Chantal said, women's liberationists getting together, and they were wanting to set up a women's centre, and I think they didn't know at the time what specifically around. I think they were thinking about, like, women's health was certainly something that the women who were involved at the time were interested in, they saw as a need, and then they would have, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure, but I know that women's refuges were something that was starting to be set up. Is it Essie's in Elsie's in Sydney was the first one set up in Australia, and Women's House wasn't far behind in terms of setting up a women's refuge, and they were also happening in other countries as well. So amongst feminists at the time, women's liberationists, that was something that was being organised.
Yeah, you mentioned a bit about that political context in the 70s around women's liberation, and you were saying it was happening all around the country and around the world. Yeah. What was it about that time that gave that impetus?
I'm not sure. I mean, we'll have to go down to the exhibition that's being set up in, the Griffith Uni College Bart, which is kind of, people have been going back through all of the archives that were in the Fryer Library and that were just stored randomly in boxes here, and pulling out kind of, information. So I think a lot will be revealed by actually going and visiting that exhibition, which I haven't actually done yet.
We would have been 12 when Women's House was first established, so we've been involved for a long time, but not that long. I was just thinking before, when we were talking about what was it, 1975, that was going on at the time. My mum experienced violence from my dad, and at the time there was no supports available to her. There was no women's refuges available. There was no single mother's pension. There was no organised child care for women. So in order to leave violence, women first need a safe place to go to, an alternative place to get away from the person who's being violent, their partner, husband, whoever. And then they need an income to be able to live independently. and they need childcare so that they can get things done, maybe go to work, to help establish themselves as being independent. So from 1972 to 1975, the Labor government at the time, the Whitlam government, was really crucial, and it's a crucial step in women's liberation and women's independence because they allowed women to leave violent relationships by creating no-fault divorce in the family court. Before that, women had to provide evidence to the court as to why they should be able to divorce, like show evidence of unfaithfulness, which is really difficult to prove. They could also apply for the supporting mothers pension, which was a big change, and they could also, childcare started to be funded as well as the establishment of women's refuges. So that was an incredible change. Then going from nothing, women suddenly had the ability to be financially independent, they had somewhere to go, and they had someone to look after their kids.
It's interesting, I guess, talking about the Whitlam government bringing in those things. It did come off the back of like a concerted effort at consciousness raising from women's groups at the time. Hey, it came from the grassroots.
Absolutely, yes. And these things don't happen suddenly. Like we all of our work is underpinned by those who've gone before us. That it doesn't. It's not like there's some hero in the women's movement who suddenly got all these things happen. It happened by women talking to each other, women fighting and resisting and organising.
Over 50 years, as you said, you haven't been involved for 50 years, but you two have been involved for quite some time. What do you think has changed in, I guess, the issues that an organisation like Women's House faces, and I guess the way that you're able to provide services?
First of all, I just want to reflect that that there's the situation for women across Australia is not equal, that women who are First Nations women, black women, are going to find it harder to get support and therefore might be at greater risk of violence because of their experiences of racism, colonisation. So in terms of the women's sector, the violence against women's sector, I think there's still the risk or the temptation to be co-opted by the state, to think that being involved is, you're going to maybe able to do some positive things by being involved with the state, but there's also the risk then that become co-opted by the vision of the state, the colonisers, and you become blind to some of the needs of the rest of our sisters. So I think we need to stick to the belief that none of us are safe unless all of us are safe. So I think there's still challenges.
Well, it's interesting. There was talking to a woman, Lou Rosenstein, who was actually involved in the very early, when the refuge was being set up, and she said she remembered a conversation they had in a collective meeting, which basically they thought, well, they'd only actually have to run the refuge for 5 years, because after that time, kind of awareness about the issue of domestic violence would have been would be there, and the problem would have been solved. So, yes. So in terms of what's changed, I don't know what's changed, but here we still are. But I have to say, saying that women had the place to go, I think now we're in a situation with the affordable housing crisis that is the main problem women have in terms of actually leaving a violent relationship, because there is nowhere affordable for them to actually go. So even though there's been, incredible amounts of funding putting into kind of the issue of domestic violence, in fact it's probably harder now than it was a decade ago.
And it's so hard for women to remain independent from their abuser as well, because of the cost of living crisis, and for women who maybe are not eligible for those government safety net provisions like Centrelink, Department of Housing, say women on temporary visas, then women are really faced with the thought of being homeless, not having anything to eat, be able to get medical assistance, or returning to an abuser. And unfortunately, because of that cost of living crisis or the visa situation, that women do return because it's kind of, they've got to weigh up those risks and dangers.
And it's still kind of, even though despite sort of 50 years of kind of activism and discussion, women are still often blamed for violence they experience by police, by courts, by systems, Centrelink. So, I mean, you think things have changed, but sometimes you think, well, things haven't really changed that much. So, there's still a lot of work to do. You mean you've got kind of a rapist elected as president of the United States, and that's perfectly acceptable and fine. It's kind of, you've now got kind of an online kind of Andrew Tate types who just spewing misogynist rubbish. So you go, whoa, there's things. Some things are better.
In some ways, violence against women has been talked about more. There was the Me Too movement. There's been Our Watch was set up. There's been a lot more campaigns and discussion in the media about domestic violence and sexual violence. But as I was saying before, that a lot of larger campaigns and funding go to more mainstream organisations that maybe still don't undermine colonial capitalist patriarchy, and so it doesn't really get at the root causes of women's oppression.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, because any group that starts off as like a small grassroots group and then to stick around, there's these pressures to kind of institutionalise, and I'm sure Women's House would have experienced that over the last 50 years. I do want to talk a bit about that, about, I guess, what it does to an organisation and how Women's House has tried to combat that.
Oh, it's a bit raw for me at the moment.
Well, I would have to say Women's House still works collectively, and there's not many collectives, I think, really in existence. And that's been a struggle. There's been a lot of pressure by governments. They don't like that. They want to talk to, a manager, but they don't, we're all paid an equal amount. We make decisions by consensus, democratic ways, encouraging people to participation in decision making. So that's one of the ways that we've tried to resist that sort of institutionalisation.
I kind of think that the moment you take government money, then you're already compromised, because then you have to fit within funding guidelines, meet reporting requirements, etc. But saying that, I also love and feel honoured to be continue to work here in an organisation that is consciously political and such great co-workers, and to be able to work as a collective.
It's interesting that collective process. I suppose it's very different to the idea of giving a woman shelter who's leaving a domestic violence situation, but it still seems to be kind of feminine in a way, like for feminists, like this kind of egalitarian collective consensus kind of processes. Do you see that as much a part of what Women's House is about as like the providing services?
Definitely. It's a model for change, that if we see that hierarchical institutions and structures as being part of the problem, because that's kind of the model for patriarchy and for capitalism, probably for colony as well. So having shared decision making, having consensus is integral.
Well, especially, an organisation that's working with the issue of violence and kind of understands violence as kind of tactics to kind of maintain power and control and domination. If you want to undermine that, then you're thinking about that totally, about those, and hierarchies are kind of an institutionalised system of domination where structurally you give power over, one person over many. So yes, it is something to question, and it's not an easy necessarily thing to do because you arrive to work collectively from growing up in a society that just accepts that hierarchies are natural and normal and the best way to run things. So it's not it can be a challenge. but it's a work. It's kind of any kind of organisational structure has its own challenges. It's just what challenges you choose to run with.
50 years is a long time for organisation. Are there lessons that have been learnt by Women's House that you think have helped the longevity of it to survive?
I think part of the longevity maybe is that being very passionate about your analysis of violence and being very passionate about wanting to communicate that as a way of beginning to solve that problem. So in terms of a feminist analysis of violence, and that's sometimes not been very popular at all to hear, because people like to kind of usually think about violence as sort of interpersonal issues, interpersonal conflict rather than a structural problem, then I think that's maybe one of the things that have kind of given it longevity, because it gives you a purpose for what you're doing.
I don't know. When I first came across Women's House, there was a high turnover. If someone had worked here for 2 years, that was considered a long time. But at the time, there was a collective of about 24 workers who were sharing wages for six people, and they were also on the dole at the time, which you could do because it was the 1980s. But they were working like 80-hour weeks and getting paid terrible money, but they did it because they were passionate about it and committed. And then some stage, maybe in the late 1980s, more funding was provided, and as a result, women couldn't work here and be on the dole at the same time. And once the wages were better, workers stayed longer. So that's a change in the dynamics for workers here. I would say that having an employment, it's important to look for feminists who are applying rather than just looking at qualifications and experience. So looking at someone's understanding about explanations for violence, why does violence against women occur, is crucial. Because that's what you'll get. Otherwise, you could have a bunch of social workers and none of them feminists, or none of them having an analysis of violence against women, and we would fall apart. We would never have lasted 50 years.
Yeah, no, it was at the times when things were fairly precarious. It was a political commitment that kind of carried the organisation through. I don't think it would have survived without that at various points. Should we say?
Yep. I can think of a few of those points.
A few of those debacles and a few of those disasters. Yeah, but we won't go into.
I guess a lot of things have changed outside of this organisation in government policy and culture. We sort of touched on it earlier, but I guess, do you have any reflections on that, on the way that, the policy and cultural aspect of your work has changed?
When we first started working at Women's House, rape and marriage wasn't considered a crime in Queensland. That became considered a crime in around, I think, 1989. There's been some significant legal challenges, but there's still lots of same old struggles that women go through to be believed, to get support from the armed might of the state, and plenty of instances when the system is letting women down still. And I think there's still challenges, especially for First Nations women. I know you were at that meeting the other day about the coercive control laws.
I mean, there's big problems of police misidentifying, an aggressor in a relationship, so they get called out, especially to, a situation where a woman doesn't actually speak English, and the perpetrator will kind of look and behave as nice as pie and tell a story, and the police will then decide that she is to blame in that. They may put a domestic violence order on her or charge her with something. And I suppose we're concerned that the recent coercive control laws that becoming now criminalised, that especially First Nations women run a real risk of being misidentified and criminalised. So legal responses to violence against women really can be quite problematic. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think, just regarding those laws, that it's a situation of a well-intentioned law that might have bad side effects, or do you think the law itself is like a sort of men's equality kind of thing or something?
Oh, I think it was. People think there's an assumption that it was well intentioned, but I mean, it's about the unintended consequences of that. Unlike kind of some of the family laws that were introduced in the 90s by Howard, which were very kind of prioritising men's rights over children. I don't think the coercive control laws, the intention behind them wasn't to kind of.
I thought it was after Hannah Clark was murdered. Her and her children were set alight by the children's father in Coorparoo, and I think Hannah's parents campaigned with, I think, Women's Legal Service, maybe others, for changes, because I think that Hannah hadn't experienced, as far as they knew, physical violence before that, but was definitely subject to coercive control. So I think it may be with them trying to understand how that came to be, then I think there was discussion about, well, there are these behaviours that often accompany, violence that can also lead to homicide, fatalities, whatever. So maybe it was an attempt to address that. But yes, I think that oftentimes there are women who will be misidentified, as you said, as the perpetrators of violence when they're not. Because plenty of times women fight back. Women who are victims of violence will at some stage resist, as they should, and as they should, in the absence of someone there to, step in.
The woman who was the police came to serve a DVO. She was lying in a hospital on a stretcher bed, absolutely sort of beaten because he'd had her in a headlock and she'd bitten his arm
under his arm
to kind of try and get out of the headlock, and that was sort of evidence of her violence.
Yeah. They called an ambulance for this woman because she had, blood pouring out of her head, and while she was on the trestle or whatever in the hallway at the hospital, having been taken there by ambulance that they had called, they served a domestic violence order against her while she was in hospital based on what he had said.
Well, I guess one thing that's probably changed over time. There's a lot more understanding about domestic violence and a lot of change to stigma. Do you think it's easier for women to present to a service like Women's House now than it once would have been?
Oh yeah, I think there's been a lot of awareness or raising and a lot more talk compared to 1975. It wasn't even an issue that was particularly identified. So it's lots actually changed in 50 years. So that's a really good thing.
There's a lot more recognition of what violence and abuse is. Like it used to be, I suppose it's a stereotype that you haven't experienced violence unless you've got a black eye or bruises or whatever. So now I think that's starting to change, that women will recognise, or other people will recognise, that certain behaviours are abusive, but it's still the case that some women, I think, don't acknowledge that what they've experienced is abuse, and maybe in part while they're being supported by us, and they can go, a bit of a light bulb moment. Oh, okay, that wasn't right. That was pretty fucked up. It was violence.
Yeah, and I think there's much more of an understanding now that there's lots of different tactics of violence, but they're all kind of aimed at establishing power and control over somebody else, which is what so it's deliberate. It's not a kind of a sort of a random kind of isolated acts. It's actually, yep, these tactics will be used differently depending on what will work best in a given situation to establish that power or to maintain that power. So I think that's an understanding about violence that's kind of pretty out there now in the community, don't you think? Maybe.
Somewhat is Barb's facial expression.
There must be. There must be.
Yeah, I think that we, as much as we or anyone else puts out information about what violence is, what it isn't, I think that this, as you're talking about Andrew Tate and Donald Trump and stuff, there's always pushback. So I think it's kind of a never-ending struggle to maintain or to fight against women's oppression.
And there's a lot of shame as well. If you think, I've suffered violence, I've picked a bad partner, this happens to other people, not people like me. It's quite a big step, isn't it, to acknowledge that?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the same with all sexual assaults. And I think there's a tendency for us to blame ourselves and individualise it and say there's something about me that I drew this onto myself. Maybe other people, going, no, that's not my fault, great. But I think there's still that tendency to individualise it and personalise it.
And that tendency to kind of individualise it and blame women through the courts as well. So, I mean, in actual fact, if you did kind of want to report a sexual assault and actually, that there would be enough evidence to actually get to court, still incredibly difficult. It's not, I don't think that's actually changed very much at all. So unlikely that there would be a conviction made from a report of a rape or a sexual assault.
The other thing I was going to say before about living with an abusive partner is that I sometimes say to women, it's like if you've been living, with an abusive partner, even if they're not abusive all the time, that they might be causing you to doubt yourself, your self-talk changes. And so I think that women often say that they're trying to change their behaviour to avoid the violence, and it kind of ends up with them having a PhD in their self-talk of the things that he's been saying to them, that they're stupid or they're ugly, or if only they stopped doing that, then this wouldn't happen, or that they need them, that they couldn't survive by themselves, that if you leave me, you're going to be in the gutter, that your kids are going to be taken away, rah, 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 rah. So I think it's really hard for women to sometimes change that shame and that all the things that they've been told about themselves, to undo that. Yeah, I think that will go with any kind of oppression as well, that you're kind of immersed in it 24/7, and that it can be difficult to shift that.
All right, let's talk about the future. What do you hope the future looks like for Women's House?
Well, I mean, I suppose a bit like Lord Lou was talking about, you'd hope that it wouldn't be needed. Like, that's what you would hope for. That is like, yep, work is done. Let's go home and enjoy a drink at the public bar.
Yeah, play pool and do macrame, whatever.
What about the immediate future of the organisation? I mean, how are things looking for the organisation now?
Well, for tonight, starting from tonight, there's our archives exhibition starting. Party, party, party. Beyond the party.
It's really been interesting since COVID. We've actually received quite a bit more funding. There's been actually quite a few workers newly employed, especially for Brisk. There's kind of an idea that we've always rented refugees on the private rental market, which is more and more difficult because everybody knows how difficult it is now to rent houses, but to talk about building a purpose-built refuge, so that will kind of be an interesting project. I mean, there's lots of different campaigns in terms of things that maybe had been identified through the Yadjan, First Nations Women's Collective, to do with racist police responses, the issue of blue cards. There's all ongoing sort of campaigns around various issues. More of the same old.
Well, for now, there is the celebration exhibition, as you mentioned, of 50 years. Can you give us the details of what's at the exhibition?
So it's at the Griffith College of Art on South Bank in an exhibition space for, I think it's till the 9th. And then tonight 4 to 8 there's kind of speakers and music and comedy. Mandy Nolan's there emceeing a night. Who knows what might happen.
And at the exhibition, it's excerpts from our archives over the past 50 years. Wendy Rogers also has done a 15-minute film, and I understand that that's going to be on a loop if anyone wants to come and watch that. And there will be some Women's House workers there during the day for some time, and there'll be some workshops offered. One is a queer collage, weaving.
I think the Yadjan group can be doing some weaving down there as well at various times. There's different things going on, but I can't tell you exactly how they've been scheduled.
Oh, well, sounds great. Thanks very much, Barb and Chantal.
Thank you, too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Triple Z.
Yeah.
Yay, and congratulations.
Happy birthday, Triple Z.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yay, 1975.
Yeah, good year. That is Barb and Chantal from Women's House, and yes, what an honour it is for us at Triple Z to be sharing our 50th birthday with Women's House, and two organisations have probably been linked a bit over the years in various ways. Of course, Triple Z has always had a women's radio show going, I think, since its very beginning, as you can currently tune in, listen to Megahertz on a Monday at midday if you wanted to hear that. And of course, they still do talk quite a bit about domestic violence and other kinds of violence against women on that show, and talk about lots of other issues important for women. And let's face it, if things are important for women, they're important for us men as well. It's half the world's population are women, and not only that, but they are all our sisters, daughters, mothers, partners, and so these people in our lives that we love and we're so indebted to, we want to make the best world for them. And I'll tell you what, so it is a lot of work for us men. It's so much of the burden is carried by women when it comes to all these kind of issues about domestic violence, sexual assault, gender equality in the workplace, and all these kind of things. But a lot of it is to do with men's behaviour actually, and not anything to do with women, and so it is something that we have to step up and take responsibility as well and do our bit. Listen to the women who have a clearer view sometimes of what the situation of gender equality is than us fellas, listen to them about their analysis and their needs, and then get in and support them and do what we can, and when it comes to it, maybe make ourselves unpopular with some of the other men around us by speaking up when we see things. And that's the least that we can do for women who do so much for all of us in our species and our planet, and in the struggle as well. And of course, if there are people that you know that are in situations of domestic violence of any kind, then it's good to remember that there are services out there like Women's House, that nobody has to kind of struggle along without any assistance, that it's hard to reach out for support, but that things will be much better when we do. And so keep that in mind, and I'm sure there's other ways that we can support both Women's House and other organisations doing similar work, try to find out ways that we can pitch in and help them to keep going. Because Yeah, all these things were started through people power, just people, ordinary people getting together, talking about what's wrong in our world and what can we do to make it better. And that's going to be the force that continues to make it better, even though I guess the government stepped up and done a lot of other services now that it once wouldn't have. It's still always the impetus for change for the better always comes from just people like you and me getting together and working on doing what we can. So keep doing it, and who knows, in 50 years' time, what those who come after us will be thinking. Will they be grateful for all the work that we've done? I hope so. That's the kind of legacy that I want to leave. I'll see you next week.